Okay, hello to everybody and thanks very much for coming today. My name's Clare Parker. I'm the team leader of archival processing here at the State Library. And what I'd like to do today is to give you a bit of a peek behind the scenes at the State Library, specifically looking at the work of the archival team that I'm a member of. And that's the team that manages what we call unpublished material. So in contrast to published, which is things like books, newspapers, periodicals and magazines, things that are usually produced en masse and often widely available. Whereas unpublished or archival is things like personal papers, internal records of businesses and organisations, also original photographs which are considered unpublished, and also a lot of other formats including audiovisual, which I'll talk about more as we go along. The archival material that we work with can be quite complex. For instance, it can be very large groups of material and sometimes quite disorganised when we first get it. And it can contain a lot of different formats, some of which might be physically deteriorating in some way. So my plan for today is to give you an idea of how archivists go about making sense of the material, making sure that it's accessible for researchers to find what they're looking for, and to look after material so that it's available for people to access as far into the future as possible. Essentially, how do we first go from getting material into the library to making it ready for everybody to view? I've been at the library for about 4.5 years, and before that I was on the other side as a researcher. So for most of my pre-library career, I studied and worked as a historian at Adelaide Uni and also in the UK. And so I used archival collections, both here and at a lot of other archives. Moving from researcher to archivist and getting to go behind the curtain, so to speak, was just endlessly fascinating for me. And so that's what I'd like to recreate a bit of today, to give you an idea of what goes on behind the scenes. Before I go any further, we acknowledge today that the Adelaide region is the traditional land of the Kaurna people, and we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. We also pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal people visiting, living or working in the region, who come from other areas of South Australia or Australia. I'd also like to note that today's talk will include several images of Aboriginal people who have died, and that may cause sadness or distress to their relatives. I'll identify these images before I put them on the screen, and after the two I show quite early in the talk, there won't be any further photos. So we have a small team of archivists here at the library, but we're responsible for a lot of different processes. The two main functions of the team are collection development, which mostly relates to bringing new material into the library, and collection processing, which is largely responsible for organising, cataloguing and physically managing the collections once they're accepted into the library. We also have Indigenous collection staff who work both with new material and the existing collections to ensure that things like appropriate communities are consulted about the records we hold, and they work on elements such as culturally appropriate descriptions and access to the material. So I personally work on the collection processing side, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on. But I'll start with collection development, as that's the first step for material on its journey into the library. This is a copy of our archival collections flyer, so this is available for people who might be interested in donating to the library so they can find out how we go about that. Nearly all of our material comes as donations. These might be from individuals or families or organisations like churches, clubs, societies, or sometimes businesses, and often, but not always, if they're closing down and they'd like to make sure that their records are preserved. Anyone who's interested in donating material to us can fill in a form that's available on our website, giving a summary of what they're offering to us and why it's significant. We're only able to collect archival material that relates to South Australia in some way, either because it's about the state or created by someone from South Australia. Most of our donors are locals, but we do get plenty of donation offers from interstate and even overseas, as South Australian related material has made its way around the country and around the world. When we're made an offer of an archival donation, our collection development staff undertake a detailed appraisal to decide whether we're able to accept the donation. The library's overarching collections policy contains a set of principles that guides our collecting practices. They're designed to ensure that the State Library collection is sustainable, accessible and diverse. For the archival team, this means we have a responsibility to carefully appraise material that's offered to us. We're not able to accept everything, and we carefully make sure that what we take makes a significant contribution to understanding the whole history of South Australia, that it fits well with our existing collections, and that we can care for it and make it available in the future. We have three main factors that we consider. They're content, use and viability. Those are the words we have in our head whenever we look at archival material. For content, we look at whether it relates to South Australia and whether the content is unique and original and not otherwise available, either because it's already in our collections or available in other places. We consider its historical value to see how it contributes to the understanding of South Australia and the people who live here. And we also prioritise content relating to themes that are underrepresented in our existing collection, particularly the voices of Indigenous people. For use, the second factor, we think about the potential for how the material will be used by customers. We try to collect material that has broad research value rather than only being of interest to, say, a single family or a very narrow field of research. We also carefully think about whether the material can be made available for researchers without undue restrictions and whether we can obtain things like necessary permissions for copyright clearance. For viability, the third factor, we need to make sure that the material we collect is in a stable condition and able to be preserved long into the future. We're not able to take material that's seriously damaged, including issues like water damage or mould, and we're usually not able to take things like physical objects because we're not equipped to store and care for them like a museum might be. And this limits our ability to take certain materials like fabrics in particular, which can attract pests. We can take most audio-visual or digital donations, even when they're in obsolete formats like Betamax or floppy disk. You become an expert on past formats in this job. But we do need to make sure that the content is still usable and we have the right equipment to extract the data. Some formats, like oral history interviews, have additional special requirements to make sure that the recordings meet a certain technical standard so that we can preserve them and make them available in the long term. Formats like oral history interviews can be a really important way to capture the histories of people who are underrepresented in the written record, but they can have additional requirements. So again, our staff work closely with donors to make sure we can collect the best possible material. And while most of the material we acquire comes into the library as a donation, we are able to make a small number of purchases. The material we buy is always carefully targeted to fill recognised gaps in the collection. Our key focus at the moment is material that records the experiences of Aboriginal Australians, as we recognise that most existing archival records tend to be about Aboriginal people rather than telling their own stories. So the library was recently able to acquire an oral history interview with Kaurna elder Uncle Lewis O'Brien, who shared his stories and wisdom on three themes: know your country, love your country, the art of learning, and speaking for country. This interview is in 3 parts, and it's also special as it's one of our very first video oral histories. So rather than just being an audio recording, it's filmed and you can watch Uncle Lewis speak rather than just listening. So the link to the video can be found through our library catalogue. Another example of a recent purchase is 2 photographs of Indigenous people at Point Pearce on the Yorke Peninsula. And these images that I'm about to show are the ones I mentioned that show people who have now likely died. So these photographs are printed on the back to create postcards, and the written messages on those postcards date the images quite precisely to 1910. So we know exactly when these people were living at Point Pearce, and there are some sort of estimated identifications. We don't know exactly who the people are, but we have a fair idea who they might be. These are unique images of the people at Point Pearce. They haven't been found anywhere else in publications or other archives. It's a priority for us to expand our representation of Aboriginal people in the collections, especially at important sites like Point Pearce. And the photo on the left in particular, there's huge grins on the girls climbing the tree. They've really stuck with me as a really beautiful image. So we were able to purchase these images and they've been digitised and again are able to be accessed through our catalogue. And in recent years, we've also very occasionally visited locations to select material to acquire for the library. We usually need archival donations to be quite well listed so that we can carry out an appraisal, but in exceptional circumstances for very high significance collections, we have done some hands-on work. So in 2021, just before the West End Brewery closed down, 4 of our archivists, including me, spent several days on site at Theberton to look through the records and make a selection to acquire for the library. The brewery was still operational when we first visited, meaning we had to wear high-vis vests, steel-capped boots, and carry carbon dioxide monitors with us wherever we went. By the time 2 of us visited for the final time, some months later, the buildings were starting to be demolished around us, and we had to add hard hats to our ensemble as well. This definitely wasn't what I imagined being an archivist would be like, but it was a really great opportunity to ensure that records of this really significant and long-running South Australian business were kept for the future. So we carefully went through the records that had been kept in the office areas of the brewery, making a selection of the most significant material. We had to consider how much we were able to take, what information the records contained, and how useful it might be to researchers, as well as the types of items that we're able to look after and the physical condition of the material. And this was putting that content, use and viability considerations into practice. As these photos show, a lot of the records hadn't been particularly well looked after in recent years, and some of them were in quite poor condition, with problems like disintegrating binding and thick layers of ingrained dirt and dust. We took a sample of these types of volumes, so we took some rather than all, and we were looking for items that had high quality information that wasn't available elsewhere. We took items like hotel records, architectural plans, correspondence, advertising materials and photographs, and some staff records. And to give you a further idea, yes, that's a broken Venetian blind hanging down at the end. These felt like they'd been abandoned about 30 years ago and never gone back into. So there were a large number of things like framed items, bottles and cans, and physical memorabilia. But we have to be realistic about what kind of materials we're able to keep and care for in our function as an archive within a library, rather than, say, as a museum. We can keep what we can do is keep the things that tell the same story. For instance, we can't collect large numbers of physical beer bottles, but we're able to take many labels. And these are some of the labels we kept, which are now sleeved in archival albums here at the library. The offices we visited didn't have comprehensive company records, so we couldn't reflect the entire history of the company, but the material we did take tells a really important part of the story of West End and also Southwark hotels and breweries all over South Australia. And to finish off the collection development process, once we've selected the material that we're able to acquire, we organise a formal document that's called a deed of gift. And this is a document that legally transfers ownership to the library and often transfers copyright as well. This means that we can make the records as widely available as possible for researchers to access and to use, which is one of our core responsibilities. Once the collection development archivists have finished the process of accepting new material into the collection, it becomes the responsibility of the processing archivists to prepare the records for access and use. So processing is a term we use in archives to mean the activities needed to organise, catalogue and care for the archival material, or as we call it, arranging, describing and preserving. How much work goes into processing archival material depends on a lot of factors. The first is simply how much material is involved. Some groups of material we take are very large, sometimes 100 boxes or more, like with West End, and this obviously takes a lot of time and requires a very different approach from a single item. We tend not to take a lot of single items anymore because we tend to prefer material that has more context around it. But there are certainly lots of single items in the collection, particularly photographs, but also items like diaries. So two common types of diaries we hold are those kept by soldiers. And this is a couple of pages from one by a soldier called J.W. Mundy, who served in World War I. And again, this item's been digitised and available to view through our catalogue. This is just a couple of the first pages. Another common type is shipboard diaries, usually from emigrants travelling to South Australia. And this one's a very early, 1838, from Thomas Plummer Addison, who travelled to Adelaide. So with the very large groups, oh, sorry, I think I've skipped a page there. There we go. So for single items like any of, oh no, I have skipped a page, excuse me. Okay, we also have a very large number of single photographs in our collection, and you never know what you'll find. I hope some of you have had a chance to see some of our beautiful photographs before. These are a few I've stumbled across in recent years, just a good excuse to show some. There's a lovely stripy football team up in the top corner. There's a tram in flooding in the Goodwood Underpass in heavy floods of 1934. And this beautiful one here, which I like to think of very topically as the first Illuminate Festival in Adelaide. This is King William Street lit up in 1901 for a royal visit from the Duke of York. And even taking a photograph of those illuminations in that period was quite impressive, so I think it strikes me as a really beautiful image. For single items like these diaries and photographs, we simply allocate an archival number, and you can always see those written in the caption I've provided. In this case, they have B numbers, which means it's one of our photographs. And that serves as an identifying number for that item. We then create a catalogue record and we describe the item so that people can find it. And we also make sure the item is properly preserved. And again, I'll talk about that in more detail later on. But for bigger groups of material, it is a lot more complex. The first task we undertake is to arrange the material. There are two key principles that we work by with archival arrangement: provenance and original order. The first is provenance, and that means that we keep archival material from the same creator together and not combined with other creators. There are a few possible ways of doing that, but here at the State Library we use a system of record groups. When we get material that was created by or sometimes collected by a certain individual or an organisation, we allocate an archival number to all of that material so that it's kept together as a discrete group. We have three types of groups. We have business record groups, BRGs, society record groups, SRGs, and private record groups, PRGs. So when we started processing the West End collection, it became a business record group and got allocated the archival number BRG 398. There's no special meaning to that number itself, it's just the next available running number in the BRG sequence. The Holden collection is another one of our really large business record groups, and there's an exhibition on downstairs still around the Holden collection, and that has the number BRG 213. So it's the identifier for the whole group. Society record groups, or SRGs, include churches, so we have things like the Anglican Church, sporting clubs, community groups, and organisations including political parties. I should point out that we don't collect government records, those all go to state records, but we do collect material that relates to things like the general operation of political parties. And then finally we have private record groups, which relate to individual people or sometimes families across multiple generations. For instance, we have the Angus family, which includes early South Australian settlers, and we also have the records of a lot of people, some prominent, some not. So one example here is the former judge and governor, Dame Roma Mitchell. So these numbers are used as a unique identifier to keep all of the material together, to respect the provenance and how it originally existed and how it came to us. As an archivist, I can't, for instance, decide I'm suddenly going to start putting all the records of all the Supreme Court judges together and mix up the records of Dame Roma Mitchell with the records of John Bray, Chief Justice, whose records we also hold, to create some big judicial mega collection. I have to keep those two collections separate because that's how they originally existed. It might sound like a fairly basic idea, but it's a key element that underpins how we go about organising archives. Now, with these very large groups, one archival number isn't enough. So to take the example of the records of Scott Hicks, the film director who is best known for the Academy Award-winning film Shine about the pianist David Helfgott, we started off by allocating the number PRG 1726, but that's not enough. There are dozens and dozens of boxes of scripts and correspondence and other documents. There are films, videos, DVDs, audio recordings, photographs, and even some film props in the collection. We need to be able to keep track of all those items, and researchers obviously need to be able to find them. So we arrange the material into categories, and normally we arrange it first off into categories that we call series. We represent these series with another layer of numbering, and by that I mean we start off with the overarching number for the group, so in this case PRG 1726, and then we put a slash and the series number. So for the Scott Hicks group it looks like this. PRG 1726/1 is the first series, and the category for all of that is the material relating to the film Shine, and so forth. The categories that we use for different series depends on what's in the group. So for Scott Hicks, the series are arranged by the films he directed. For the Holden collection, a lot of the series are arranged into car models. In the Anglican Church collection, the series are largely arranged into individual churches. And within these series, we can keep adding additional layers of numbering, represented by another slash and another slash, to break down the series into sub-series and items. Again, this helps to navigate very large collections, and it also means we can give unique identifying numbers to individual items when necessary. We don't number every sheet of paper because, frankly, that would take forever, but we do often individually number photographs if they're going to be digitised, and audio-visual material like films and videos so that they can be digitised and preserved. So I'll show you how this works in practice. To use an example from the collection of early aerial photographs by D. Darian Smith, we can see how this works. This photograph is of Adelaide Oval during the Bodyline Test match in 1933, and it has the archival number BRG 397/2/20/1. And in this case, and I've highlighted in red down the bottom, BRG 397 is the overarching number given to the whole Darian Smith photographic collection. And it's a business record group in this case because the records are of his professional photographic business. And then we've got a /2. This is the next level of arrangement, and it's the category that brings together all of the early aerial photographs as opposed to other types of photographs that he produced in his career. And then there's a /20. This is because it's the 20th box of photographs within the category of early aerial images. And then finally there's a /1 because it's the first photograph in that box. And that's how we create the full number. So when you see those long numbers, that's why it exists and that's what it means. And of course, we realise that most people aren't going to find this photograph by carefully navigating down through all of these layers. Most people are far more likely to be searching our collection for cricket or Adelaide Oval and find this photo. Researchers often don't need to know what all these numbers mean, but if you want to know more about the context of the photograph, it can help you. And of course, when you'd like to get a copy to print out and put this image on your wall, it's the unique number that you quote to us so that we can find it and give you exactly what you're after. And while the archivists do have some ability to choose how we arrange the material so that it makes sense, the other major archival principle we abide by is the principle of original order. That means that wherever possible, we keep the material in the order that it was kept in by the creator or collector. To use the Darian Smith example again, this archival numbering system carefully retains the organisational structure he gave to his own photographs. He organised them by format. So in this case, BRG 397/2 represents his early aerial photographs that are glass plate negatives. The photographic format where photographs were taken on glass rather than plastic negatives, and you'll see some photos of those later on. The boxes that make up this collection of glass plate negatives were numbered in a certain order, which is why this was the 20th box. Now, in this case, Darian Smith's system of numbering and organisation maybe wasn't perfect. It might have been once upon a time, but over his 50-year career, things maybe got mixed up a bit. In this box, box 20, there are 5 photographs of Adelaide Oval, 3 showing a cricket match and 2 showing football. And that's one of the other football ones. You can just make out the goalposts if you squint. You can zoom in if you look at it on the website. There are also more photographs of cricket tests in later boxes, including this same bodyline match again, and it looks like they should belong together. It's really tempting for me to move those around so that all the cricket matches are neatly together in chronological order and the football is separate. But it's not up to me to do that, or even to assume that they are in the wrong place. Maybe it was a mistake, or maybe there's a good reason why they're in that order. Maybe, for Darian Smith, he ordered them by images that were ordered by the same customer. Or maybe he used them together in an exhibition at some point, and that was his system. The important thing is that if items are in an obvious order, in this case in numbered boxes, I don't go mixing up the contents of them. And that's why sometimes you will find things in odd places in archival collections. We retain the order and the context of material wherever possible, and we only arrange things ourselves if there's no other way. And sometimes documents and other materials do come to us with no obvious order, so we pick a logical order to put the material in so that it's easier to navigate. Chronological or alphabetical order are the obvious ones for certain types of records, and we'll also do things like grouping formats together. So there might be a separate series for loose photographs and a series for films. Again, this both helps us to keep track of the material, and it also helps a researcher to browse the types of material, the types of records that they're interested in. Once the archivist has determined the arrangement of the group, we then move on to the second crucial part of archival processing, which is description. Once we have the material and we've determined the appropriate arrangement, we want to make sure that customers can find it. Archival description has a few different elements, which can include things like catalogue records and also lists of material we often call finding aids. At a minimum, a catalogue record for archival material needs to have the archival number, a title, a creator, so that might be an author or a photographer or an artist, the date of creation, if we know it, or an approximation if we can make that, a general description, so a summary of what the material is, and also the extent of the material. To us, extent means the physical size of the item. For a single photograph, that might be its dimensions, 10 by 12 centimetres. For larger collections, we often measure the room that the material takes up on the shelf. So if we line all the boxes up, how many centimetres or metres does that take up? You might see 80 centimetres or 25 metres in an archival record, and that will give you an idea of how much material there is to look at. So if it's 25 metres, you need to plan to come in for more than one day. There are international standards that we work by when we do archival description, including these categories that an archival record must contain. The information we include in these descriptions is structured in quite formal ways and referred to as metadata. There are also technical requirements for the language we use and how we enter the metadata into the cataloguing software. We have to follow these requirements because we need our work to be intelligible not just to the humans reading the catalogue record, but also to other computer systems. For instance, all of our archival records are also part of the National Library's Trove database, so their system needs to be able to understand our system so that all the information appears in the correct place in their catalogue as well. So when you see one of our catalogue records, it will look like this. But in the system we use to create the record behind it, it looks like this. So there's quite a bit of technical metadata that isn't visible in the public record. It's designed to be coded to provide certain information to certain systems. For individual items or fairly small groups, all of the description's likely to be in the catalogue record itself. But for larger groups, we often provide additional documents that help researchers to navigate the collections and find the parts they're interested in. So these might be quite brief, such as listing the title of the series, like this example on the left for Holden, which helps researchers to get an overview of the collection, and then they can go and find the catalogue record for the series that they're interested in. Or sometimes lists can be very detailed, where they list all of the folders or files or sometimes even items within a series. And if you see that example on the right, this is for the series relating to Shine in the Scott Hicks collection. This can be very time-consuming to create, so we usually only do it for highly significant groups or where it's really hard to make sense of the material without an additional listing. And sometimes the people who donated the material provide us with a really good detailed list, so we can use that as the basis for our description, and we love it when that happens. Because it's not possible to list everything individually, this is one of the key ways that finding and using archival material differs from using books. In a normal library catalogue, each book has its own catalogue record. We think of that as having a one-to-one relationship. One book has one catalogue record. But in archives, one catalogue record can often cover a large amount of archival material. When we arrange and describe archives, it's our job to effectively help the researcher to narrow down what they need to look through. A researcher might take a year to look through all of the West End group, trying to find something specific. But by arranging into the categories or series and listing and describing those series, we can help the researcher so they can ideally narrow their search down to a box or two. And we describe material at lots of different levels. We always summarise the entire contents of a large archival group very briefly to give researchers a general idea of what the group contains. So this is the description of the entire Holden group that appears in the catalogue. It's a very high-level description, a few keywords, formats listed. But if we then hop down to the next level, to a series level, and here we've got series 28, which relates to the FJ Holden. We're getting more specific as we go down through the levels. So here, the summary description that's provided in the catalogue record summarises just the material in Series 28 that relates to the FJ Holden. And sometimes items are described individually, such as, again, within this same series, we've moved down actually 2 layers now. And this is an individual item. It's an FJ Holden sales brochure. That's the front cover there. And that has just a small description of that single item. When we individually describe photographs, we try to include lots of detail so that a researcher can find the photograph using keywords, because obviously we can't search visually yet, and also understand where the photo is taken. So to use another example of a Darian Smith photograph of cricket at Adelaide Oval, in this case is the earlier 1929 test, we've included the description on the right there, and you can see we've included the orientation of the photo, so it's looking southeast, so people can work out where we are, and the fact that the short-lived Palais de Danse on the River Torrens can be seen in the background up at the top of the image. Because that's quite a rare image. The Palais de Danse was only there for a couple of years, and people might be looking for that specific feature when they're searching in the catalogue, so they'll be able to find it. But you'll notice that in this description, we haven't included background information about who won the test match, or the history of Adelaide Oval, or the Palais de Danse. Sometimes we can include that sort of information elsewhere in the record, but there are quite firm guidelines that we work to about what information goes into what section of an archival record. As you can imagine, it can be very time-consuming to describe items individually, and that's why we're often only able to provide summary descriptions at a series level. But we also do make full use of our different archivists' skills and knowledge to make descriptions as good as we possibly can. Archivists usually need to be generalists. We can be called upon to process material about any topic, and we need to sort of learn enough about it so that we can do a decent job of describing it effectively. But within our team of processing archivists, we have some specialties too that have added some extra depth to the descriptions of some of our groups. So our archivist Sharon, who processed the collection of the artist Robert Hannaford, has an art degree herself. So she was able to describe Robert Hannaford's work in a way that I never could have, for instance. Another one of our archivists who's worked on many of our wine-related collections over the years has close family connections with the prominent local winemakers, and so she was able to bring her understanding of the business to working on those groups. And sometimes our specialties are just very niche. You may have noticed me harping on about the cricket photos in Darian Smith. One of my niche areas of knowledge is Test cricket, and I realised when I was working on these photos that years of going to Adelaide Oval since I was a kid and learning to read all the detail in its gorgeous scoreboard had set me up very well to identify this image. This photograph was a glass plate negative with no label, no caption on it when I first saw it, but after it was digitised, I was able to zoom in really close on the scoreboard, as illustrated here. And I was just able to make out the names and the scores, and I compared it to a historic scorecard of the game online and confirmed that this was taken on the first day of the famous bodyline test. England are batting and they're 4 down, for those who are interested. Niche knowledge, as I say. The other reason I mentioned this is also that it's a testament to the quality of this image after it was digitised and the digitisation work that I was able to read that scoreboard. As you can see, it's very, very zoomed in. I would never have been able to do that from the original negative. And that takes me nicely on to the final part of the work we do in processing archival material, which is preservation. Archivists are responsible for general preservation work to ensure that archival materials are handled appropriately and stored in a way that keeps them in good condition for as long as possible. We work with a lot of different formats, and all of them have different risks and different needs. We have specialist staff outside of the archives team who do a lot of the more technical work. And as archivists are the first ones to handle the material we acquire, it's our responsibility to understand the preservation needs of different materials and refer onwards to other staff. Our conservation staff undertake specialist work like repairs, complex cleaning, including of negatives like the glass plates, and creating housing or containers for fragile materials. Our digital preservation staff create digital copies of all formats of material to a very high standard, as you can see, for long-term preservation. And they also create access copies for researchers to view. And all of the collection items I've showed today have been digitised by our library's specialist digitisation staff. Every single format we handle can deteriorate over time and in lots of different ways. Our storage areas have carefully controlled temperature and humidity, and also minimum exposure to light with auto lights that go off after a certain period of time, and also management of pests such as moths, when that's the best starting point to keep archival materials stable. But in addition to that, archivists can do quite a lot of often fairly straightforward tasks to make sure that the materials remain in good condition. A big task we undertake is what's called rehousing, or putting archival materials into containers that will keep them in good condition. Wherever possible, we use acid-free housing, so special folders, envelopes and boxes that don't contain the acids normally found in these types of materials. Acids like that can cause paper to break down over time. Sometimes certain types of papers are very vulnerable to fast deterioration. In the Scott Hicks collection, we found a large amount of fax paper, that shiny thermal paper you might remember from fax machines. The problem is that the heat treatment that creates that ink doesn't last very long, and these papers from the 1980s and 90s were already severely faded. The archivists arranged for the thermal papers to be digitised so that the content wasn't completely lost, because eventually that text will fade entirely and someone will come to that box and find a blank sheet of paper. Different photographic formats also have their own special preservation needs. Photographic prints also need acid-free housing, and colour images may need to be sent for digitisation before any deterioration in the colour occurs. You get those sort of pink shifts in old colour photographs sometimes. Photographic negatives made of acetate, the plastic, need to be prepared for storage in a special cold store, where very low temperatures help to slow deterioration. These photographs show packets of acetate negatives, again from the Darian Smith collection, so these are the acetate rather than the glass. And this is as we first received them in those paper sort of packets that you can see on the left. And then they were rehoused into archival quality sleeves and plastic folders, and that's on the right. This photo of the old packets also really clearly illustrates the damage that something like light can do. The packets on the left of the box are almost white in colour, but the ones on the right are very yellowed. This is likely due to them being exposed to light over many years. So my theory is maybe they were in a box on a shelf. The ones that were up the back of the box were protected from the light, and the ones that were sort of poking out with the light coming onto them have turned yellow. So that's why we do things like keep control of light where we keep our archival collections. Other photographic formats, such as the glass plate negatives, need to be carefully handled with gloves, as well as sent for specialist cleaning, wrapping, boxing and digitising. So these are some photographs that were taken of me working on the Durry and Smith glass plates a few years ago. You can see I'm wearing white cotton gloves. We often don't wear gloves to handle archival material, but for a format like this, we don't want fingerprints and things on them. Some of the other formats we deal with, reels of film need to be carefully handled, like photographic negatives, and prepared for cold storage. And again, this is a joint effort between archivists and the digital preservation staff. We have things like videos and audio cassettes and other types of magnetic tape formats, and they urgently need to be processed and digitised. Magnetic media is a very vulnerable format, and as well, the machines available to play it are becoming obsolete. So there's an international push to preserve all magnetic formats as soon as possible. We also have collections that include digital material on old formats, such as floppy disks, as well as newer digital storage devices like USBs or hard drives. The area of digital archiving is relatively new, and again, the archivists work with our colleagues to find the best ways to collect, process and preserve digital files. And sometimes we come across hazards in the collection too, so we have to be very careful when we're handling some types of material. Problems like mould, deteriorating leather, and severe acidic deterioration of film and negatives can be dangerous for staff and researchers, so we have procedures in place to protect us from these risks. This includes things like working on material while it's inside a fume hood, much like you might see in a chemistry lab. These days we're very careful only to accept new material that's known to be safe and in good condition, but there are very old parts of our collection which can pose some of these problems. And digitisation, of course, is the key method we have to make archival material widely available, while also preserving the original for long-term safekeeping. And the material we digitise, that doesn't mean that we get rid of the original, we always hold that as well. It usually falls to the archivists to be the first ones to suggest material for digitisation, and we're often looking to create a digital version to prevent too much handling of a fragile or very valuable item. And we also select material that we know will have a very wide interest, particularly visual formats like photographs, artworks and plans. We have a lot of architectural business records in our collection, and recently one of our archivists realised that we have a beautiful collection of architectural plans from the Jackman Gooden collection that should be digitised for preservation and also for access. This is an example of one of the plans from the collection, showing the Ramsgate Hotel at Henley Beach. They're absolute works of art, with really well-preserved colour illustrations from the late 19th century mainly. The work on this collection and the digitisation has been happening very recently, and just last week we had a researcher who found a digitised plan in this group for the exact building that they were writing a history of. And ultimately, that's why it's such a joy to be able to work here as an archivist. What starts off as material that's sitting out somewhere in the community gets appraised, accepted into the library collection, arranged, described and preserved so that a researcher can find the thing they're interested in. In this case, the exact item was available for that customer online. Other times, it might mean going through a few boxes to find what you're after. But it's our job to make sure that you can find those few boxes and that people in 50 or 100 years' time can find those same boxes and that they're still in good condition. Thank you. Happy to take questions.